Hello, I'm Sondra Rapoport, Roman historian. Thank you for joining me again tonight as we continue our talk on ancient sex. Tonight, we're going to explore that subject in the world of ancient Egypt. This is a very interesting subject in ancient Egypt because you don't really see a lot of coverage of it, but tonight we're going to delve into it and we are going to figure out its secrets. And we're going to even put together a couple of fragments and reveal some very exciting and interesting imagery. We're going to have a lovely evening tonight. Thank you for joining me. Ancient Egypt and the world of the pharaohs, and that whole area is a very significant and serious area of study. There's no doubt of it. Its imagery is significant. And this is the type of thing that we're used to seeing in ancient Egypt. These types of gilded statuary, or these types of figures rendered in deep stone, or even imagery that we associate perhaps with the Tomb of Tut, with the giant golden sarcophagi, or places in which to revere the gods and the pharaohs. The Cairo Museum is filled with this sort of typical Egyptian imagery that we expect to see every day. However, Egypt is not always exactly as perfect and well-behaved and without sexual imagery as you may think, as may be presented to you in the museums or in the textbooks or in your average documentary on ancient Egypt. Ancient Egypt also was a place that celebrated the human form, explored sexuality, explored humanity, and also had a lot of fun with the human form. Also in modern Egypt as well. I love this, the rites on the Nile. Always, there's a beautiful, this particular dancer was absolutely lovely. And sexuality within Egypt is still a part of the culture, intertwined, its own type of thing, its own kind of role. But it's still part of it. So let's look back at the very beginning. Let's start at creation. I love that belly dancer. She was fabulous, and it was a wonderful evening that night at the Ritz-Carlton on the Nile. The chef was wonderful, the food was delicious, and it was fun to experience Egypt. Although that wasn't an ancient Egyptian performance, nor was the dinner ancient Egyptian, although a couple of the dishes I suspect may have been. But it was interesting to be involved in the Egyptian culture. And I have to tell you that also, while I completely and totally enjoyed the performance, my son afterwards, she did flirt with him. And I think that it was a very formative experience for him in Egypt as well, which is kind of what Egypt is kind of for. In the ancient world, Egypt is a place of exploration. Alexandria was all up an exciting metropolitan international city. And so sex and new experiences and all of these sort of things would have been part of the Mediterranean experience in Egypt during the time period of ancient Greece and ancient Rome. Even in ancient Egypt, Alexandria wasn't in existence yet. But sex was very much a part of not only everyday life, as how else would you have continued to have humans, but it was also a part of religious life and political life as well. So let's explore this a little bit further. Let's see where sex in ancient Egypt goes. But, we're going to have to start at creation, at the very beginning. And in Egypt, the story of creation is an interesting story. It's actually a masturbation story. So the very first god, Atum, he formed himself from the primordial ooze, and there he was. And from the results of his masturbation came forth more gods. And this started the beginnings of other gods who brought other gods, and then you had the basic 9 gods of the Egyptian pantheon, and then more gods that came off from there. But the story of creation in ancient Egypt begins with a little bit of masturbation. And then it continues with a union between the sky and the earth, which are kept apart sometimes by their father, but are always looking to unite and to procreate. And procreation and sexual union and sexual imagery was a large part of Egyptian culture and Egyptian life and Egyptian religion. So let's take a look at some of this interesting imagery from the very creation of ancient Egypt. A sexual creation, just like most creations are. Part of the Egyptian creation myth is the union between earth and sky, here represented so beautifully in this ancient papyrus, where you see the goddess Nut, the female, stretching over all of creation, the boats on the Nile, all of the symbolism and imagery, stretching her legs out far and her arms out wide in a lovely actual yoga pose, which I am a little jealous of. But then underneath, reclining, is her consort Geb, representing also earth. And consort, I suppose, in this particular instance, represents your favored sexual partner, your designated sexual partner. But here they are, but there is so much separating the two of them. Other representations of the goddess Nut and her consort, sexual partner Geb, show her with the imagery of the sky. And you can even see the boats traveling up and down the Nile, also represented on her legs. And she also represents the transition between night and day. At the end of every day, she eats the sun, which is born again each morning. And as you see the male figure beneath her, he is without phallus in this particular image, but he is garbed in leaves, in brown imagery, representing green hair, representing the earth, and she represents the sky above. And I'm satisfied and happy with this next image, because this is more of a direct sexual image. Here you see again the goddess, representing the sky, overarching, same exact position. But now her consort is with quite an impressively erect phallus. There is nothing separating the two of them. I think that the sexual union will actually happen. And, after so much coming between them and so much, there's so much creation and so much imagery and so forth, it is a little bit of relief to see a little more of a simplistic type of image here of creation and sexuality. And this is an erotic imagery. Now, erotic imagery doesn't always mean extremely pornographic and meant to incite sexual excitement. Erotic also means sexual type imagery, sexual love, that type of sort of affection. This is an imagery it's supposed to represent procreation. So of course it's sexual. And so here we have an excellent representation of it. This brings us now to the story of Osiris and Isis. Fascinating story. Also reminiscent of the beginnings of Rome, where it's brother versus brother, Romulus versus Remus. This is Osiris versus his brother Seth. There's a lot of, brotherly rivalry between the two of them. And Seth eventually can't take it anymore for an assortment of reasons. And so eventually there is a party, and he challenges each guest to get into a coffin, which he says will fit someone quite perfectly. It happens to be Osiris. He gets in the coffin, it fits him perfectly. Seth shuts the coffin and hides it away. Osiris dies within. Isis, his wife, is distraught. She goes and searches and finds him, opens it up and finds him within. Although dead, if you're a god, that's not the end. So she goes off looking for the ingredients that she needs in order to resurrect her husband and her love. And during that time period, Seth's like, no, I don't think so. I killed him. I don't want him to stay that dead. So he takes out his vengeance and he cuts Osiris into 14 pieces and scatters them. So Isis dutifully goes and finds all of the pieces. Throughout all of Egypt, she looks far and wide. She finds all of the pieces except for one. The most important one, the most unfortunate one to lose. She can't find his penis. It has been eaten by a fish. It's in some stories I've read one, some stories I've read 3 different fishes within the Nile. I don't know further stories of the fish. I know that some of these fishes were then in the ancient world revered and were part of things that you ate during Holy Period and so forth. I don't know what happened to the particular fish that ate Osiris's phallus. I don't know if he became the most virile of all fish amongst the Nile. I don't know if he was the father of all other fishes. I don't know if any sort of godlike sexual fish power passed down to him in any sort of way. That isn't in any sort of the writings whatsoever, what happened to the fish. But I do know what happened is that if you reassemble your husband and he's a god and you can resurrect him, but he is phallus free, he's going to require a phallus, especially if you still want to sire or have a son with with your husband. So Isis created a penis for him, a magical penis, Osiris and his magical phallus. And from this missing magical phallus, she was able to conceive. And she was able to conceive the god Horus, who we all know and love. His eye watches over everybody. And he is the bird-headed or the bird god, who is the child of Osiris and Isis. And he's lovely. And he also becomes an extraordinarily significant and important god. I particularly really enjoy him as well. It's a fabulous statue and it's a fabulous god. It's a fascinating story also that, one of the origins of one of the most important gods in Egypt comes from a missing and then recreated a magical phallus. When I was in Cairo at the museum, I made sure to take a lot of pictures just for you. So here is an excellent papyrus of Osiris. He is the guy with the green skin because he's dead. And he has, his interesting story. But between the mixture of images between Cairo and also excellent exhibition in Minneapolis, we can kind of get to see the story of Osiris a little bit more. This next image is actually a drawing that was part of the exhibition. It was on the wall, and it shows the scene of Osiris. He's dead, and there is Isis hovering over him. She is taking the form of a bird, but where his penis or his phallus should be, there's a series of lines. It is not because it is magical or it is currently missing. This is also because of something I discussed in our first lecture, the fig leafing of statues, in which the Roman and Greek statues, the male genitalia was covered up with marble fig leaves in order to preserve their modesty. Also, early Christians, late Christians, and others came to this area, and they actually either carved out phalluses because they were believers and they wanted to keep them for their own means. We can discuss that later. But mostly it was because of people from other religions, Christian religions, early Christians, that actually carved out what they thought was offensive, obscene, or sexual type imagery. So in this particular image, that is why the phallus of Osiris is missing at this point, because she would most definitely need the phallus in order to conceive her son Horus. And I really, really enjoy this next image, also from the same exhibit in Minneapolis. This is not a real mummy. This is a pseudo mummy, a made mummy, but it's ancient also from probably about the 19th dynasty or so. Judging from the artistry, I'll have to look it up and get back to you. But, however, if you look at the mummy itself, it is made out of like corn and seeds and so forth, natural type things. But do you see its erect phallus? That is there as a representation of Osiris. Osiris, while dead, has still virility. He's still able to produce a child, a son, Horus, significant god, whose head is on the top of the sarcophagus here. You can't mistake the imagery. But there are a lot of images of mummies where their phalluses are made erect in perpetuity, or images of Osiris with the erect phallus, of the ability to procreate and continue on. It's not sexual in the type of way of the desirous type of modern way. It's sexual in the type of procreational, civilizational continuation type of way. It's very type of interesting symbolism and imagery, sexual, but not meant to excite. In our last talk, we had a great deal of fun getting to know the Roman god Priapus, the god who is extremely proud of his giant, extraordinarily large, well-endowed, very heavy penis, which seems to require weighing. He is a lot of fun, and I think we all enjoyed his imagery. It is one of the biggest draws for tourists at Pompeii, and I think we all understand why. You will be very pleased to know that the Romans and the Greeks were not the only ones who had a god who was extraordinarily proud and not afraid to show off his giant erection. And in ancient Egypt, this god was named Min. And I'm going to show you a few images of him. But he is a god of fertility. And, generally a god of sexuality and fecundity and all of the things that a god of fertility must do. Generally fun things. So Min is the type of god that is shown often he is shown, well, every time I've seen him, with the erect phallus in the horizontal position. I'll show you a few images so you can get to know him a little bit better. As promised, here is Min, the Egyptian Priapic god, proudly showing off his erect phallus. There is absolutely no doubt as to what this is. In the next image, quite unfortunately, the very tip of it has been cut off, but he doesn't seem to be too perturbed by it. He is here represented as well. One of the interesting things about Min, and going back to the very first image that I showed you of him, is that he also seems to enjoy lettuce. Lettuce is one of the types of things that the ancient Egyptians considered to be an aphrodisiac, particularly the type of lettuce that was grown in that part of Egypt. When you broke the stalk or when you cut into it, it released a milky type fluid, which reminded the people of semen. And so they therefore associated it with fertility and also began to think of it as an aphrodisiac, lettuce. Well, I don't know how effective the lettuce is in the modern world, but in the spirit of Min, I decided to have a little bit for dinner tonight. Perhaps we will see how it turns out. So let's now leave the realm of the divine and of, godlike Egyptian sex for procreation and creation. And let's enter the world of everyday humans. Here, we're going to see some interesting practices regarding sex for fun. Also, the royal practice of incest, and also sex for political purposes. So I think it would be kind of fun to go to something that's very, very rare. Usually you don't see a lot of depictions of overt sexual explicit acts in ancient Egyptian art, like we're familiar with in Pompeii, But what we have in Turin is we have a papyrus called the Turin Erotic Papyrus, and it's extremely rare, and it shows explicit sexual scenes, which is, as I said, rare for ancient Egypt. In the volumes of papyri and sculpture and inscriptions and stone, we don't see a lot or practically any explicit sexual imagery. However, this one famous example is of a papyrus depicting clearly highly sexual acts. It remains a mystery as it's so rare, but the fact that it is not religious and is purely for fun is quite obvious. Remember, I did warn you that this is a highly fragmentary piece, the Turin Erotic Papyrus. So I will have to show you a few recreations of the scenes, as it is a little bit difficult to make it out. And I really want you to see what's up. This papyrus is showing, apparently, the erotic adventures of one semi-balding man with a concubine in a variety of unique, creative, and highly acrobatic positions. I think he had a good time. And I think he probably wouldn't mind us all knowing that 3,000 years later. Let's take a peek inside the bedrooms of the ancient Egyptian royals, and let's see some of their sexual practices and see some of the practices that were enacted in order to ensure family lines and the continuation of dynasties. I'm speaking of incest and sexual practices that were common in ancient Egypt. If you remember, the pharaohs were god kings. This was a theocracy. And being gods, god kings, you wanted to keep things within the family line, and you wanted to pass down the bloodline and make sure that it was pure. And so one of the best ways to do this was through incestual marriage. And it was a tradition that was throughout the years of ancient Egypt and in the history of the pharaohs. But interestingly, also the Ptolemies, the rulers that were Greek that came after Alexander the Great, who were not Egyptian by any means, they also carried on this tradition of incestual marriage, of marriage amongst brothers and sisters. I ask you why. Now, every time I ask you why, the answer is always the same thing: the concept of legitimization and the power of imagery. The Ptolemies were Greek. They were after Alexander the Great, as I mentioned, not Egyptian, but trying to rule Egypt. And the way that they did this was to assume the role of Pharaoh. They looked like Pharaoh, they acted like Pharaoh, they did like Pharaoh, they married like Pharaoh, they assumed the imagery, they walked the walk, they talked the talk, and they married brothers and sisters together. While these are depictions of married couples from the ancient Egyptian world, you have to remember that these are also most likely brothers and sisters, or the closest of cousins. This is a theocracy. Pharaohs were gods on earth, so they wanted to keep it in the family, so to speak, before, of course, the understandings of genetics and the abnormalities that can cause. Aside from Tut and Ramses the Great, the most famous pharaoh of them all is Cleopatra the Seventh, known simply as Cleopatra. She's known from Shakespeare, from history, from Augustan propaganda. She is the reason why I actually ended up studying what I studied in graduate school, why I started following the Augustus path, is through my initial research into this powerful, dynamic female leader, Cleopatra. And it pushed me into not only learning about her, but also teaching about her. And it was and ultimately ended me up teaching the realm of Augustus at Harvard. So I'm always going to be grateful to Cleopatra for that. But studying her has been one of the most fascinating things that I have ever done. Let's take a tiny little peek into her history and into just Egyptian sex, some of which is Augustan propaganda and some of which is true, but she's a highly sexual figure, and she's not afraid to promote that and to use that, and there's nothing wrong with that. I love this watercolor of Cleopatra. It is not ancient by any means, but I really feel that it captures the spirit of her own mythology and her imagery. She's beautiful, she's alluring, she's sexual, she's powerful, she's exotic. These are all the things that she's known for. Most of these things are from Augustan propaganda. Nonetheless, she is the pharaoh that is most celebrated for her sexual role, which is inherent in that position. But in traditional literature and art, that is what she is most known for. While she was incredibly intelligent and educated and shrewd, the most powerful leaders of the Mediterranean world during her time, she is known mostly for her sexuality and for her use of sex to supposedly further her own plans. And, you know, I can't help myself by always going back to Augustus, but this is Augustan propaganda, still at work, still affecting us today, still in Hollywood, still affecting art, and still affecting how we every day see and know Cleopatra. Let's begin the story of Cleopatra and Caesar, who I have behind me. We have all heard the story of Cleopatra sneaking into the palace to see Caesar wrapped in a carpet and being unfurled in a highly dramatic fashion. It was done quite well in the Elizabeth Taylor movie. The details of her exact entrance are still in a little bit of debate. But what is not in debate is the fact that after Caesar and Cleopatra met, they were then allies. They were then together. They joined forces, and it was quite obvious that they began having an affair. After settling the civil war between Cleopatra and her brother husband, Caesar and Cleopatra began to take up more in earnest, actually. They took a beautiful cruise down the Nile, highly romantic, and Caesar spent quite a bit of time there. And Cleopatra did present him with a son, his only son. And it was a romantic and wonderful event that artists love to depict, and it's shown within movies, but it is a wonderful example also of my point of sex for political advantage. Was it a love match? Perhaps. Caesar's pretty awesome. Cleopatra's pretty awesome. But was it for a political advantage? Oh, yes. Most totally. Cleopatra soon presented Caesar with his only son, which is highly significant. He has another child, Julia, who married Pompey the Great, and when she died, that was the beginning of the rivalry between Caesar and Pompey. But Caesar had a son with Cleopatra. This would present later problems for Augustus. This son was named Ptolemy Caesar. And here is a lovely picture of Cleopatra and her son, Ptolemy Caesar, also known as Caesarion, doing the typical pharaonic type sacrifices and imageries associated with that sort of role. When Caesar returned to Rome, after he did acknowledge his son, Caesarion, Ptolemy Caesar, Cleopatra arrived later in Rome with Caesarion by her side, the son of Caesar and Cleopatra. And her presence was highly controversial, particularly since Caesar was actively trying at that time to convince the Roman people that he did not want to be a king. And she was actually in Rome when Caesar was assassinated, leaving her without a strong Roman ally until she met Mark Antony. Cleopatra famously met Mark Antony officially as his position as leader of the East on a sumptuous boat, appearing as goddess of beauty and love, not at all taking into account the fact that Mark Antony was married to Octavian's sister Octavia at this time, and they already had children together. However, Antony could not resist the pull of Cleopatra. She most definitely used the power of her personal sexual draw. While not known for being extremely beautiful, she was known for being extremely fascinating, intelligent, and alluring. Octavian's letters to Antony during this time period, when they were fiercely exchanging letters back and forth, blaming each other for an assortment of different flaws, Octavian/Augustus was not too pleased with the fact that Antony had left his sister and taken up with Cleopatra and began having children, and even entered into an Egyptian marriage with her. And in their letters, he is quite clear at how displeased he is and how distasteful he finds this whole situation, which was perfect for him in setting up a civil war. Antony and Cleopatra did have several children together, and over time, tensions between Octavian in Rome and Antony in Egypt came to a head at the Battle of Actium, where the lovers were famously defeated at sea, and then leading to their Shakespearean-style star-crossed end, leaving behind a love story that's definitely thought of as passionate, but also as intensely sexual as well. By looking at sexuality and erotic imagery in ancient Egypt, we can see how it is an integral part of their mythology, culture, politics, religion, and everyday life. Everybody has sex every day. And throughout the ages, and throughout civilizations, throughout religions, throughout different languages, sex plays a similar role in interestingly different roles in our lives, regardless of our place within society and so forth. It's a fascinating topic. And by looking at something so intimate, you can really learn a lot about a culture. So let's continue our journey next week through the world of ancient sex by looking at the world of professional and institutionalized sex. And then after that, we will continue by looking at homosexuality, lesbianism, and alternative sexual lifestyles in the ancient world. So I'm Sondra Rapoport. I am your local neighborhood Roman historian, and I am so happy to guide you on this very interesting journey through the ancient world. And as we apply the lessons of the ancient into the modern. So remember always that you can always rewatch any of my videos on my YouTube page. You can find the link in my little bio. And, you know, I really enjoy having these talks with you. And let's get together again next week. And, you know, I really hope that you have a lovely evening.